Information fueled,
opinion driven. This is Nashville's Morning News with Dan Mandis.
And so, my fellow Americans,
we talk news.
7:07, Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. Appreciate you being here along with Joe and Jones, Johnny B. Want to welcome on into the program one of my favorite guests ever, Bill O'Reilly, is joining us. Sir, how are you doing this morning?
Good, Dan. Thanks for having me back. How are you?
I'm doing well. So I want to talk about your new book because it is. I always think, you know what? He keeps outdoing himself and confronting the president's no spin assessments from Washington to Biden. And one of the things that I always like about your many, many books is that I learn new things. And I want you to talk about, first off, George Washington. And George Washington's problem with his mother, because it is so relatable.
Sure, and nobody knows it. And that's why we opened the book with it. So I wanted to grab everybody's attention right from the jump, Dan. And when you're investigating George Washington, and that's what we do, Martin Dugard, my co-author, and I, we're basically detectives, investigators, trying to find out things that people don't know, that haven't been widely circulated. So we came across some letters that George Washington's mom had written to local papers in Virginia while the general was conducting the Revolutionary War. So you remember Washington was running all over the country fighting the British. His mother was telling the press, my son Georgie is trying to starve me to death. He won't give me any money. And the newspapers printed this, and it drove Washington nuts. So they did not have a good relationship. He did not even go to her funeral or provide a headstone. And it's a fairly, you're right. I mean, a lot of people have trouble in their families, and so did George.
One of the things, as I read through this book, and I just the style of the way that I read, I kind of flip through various chapters, and I just, before I sit down to read the entire thing in its entirety, I'll just go to different chapters and names that I recognize and I'm interested in. And I thought that when you're talking about the likes of Ronald Reagan and somebody who had such a legacy, of course, on the conservative party, the Republican Party, but also in showbiz and just on American culture. When you talk about Ronald Reagan, there's so much out there about him. Was it difficult to find something about Reagan that people didn't already know?
Well, because I wrote the book Killing Reagan, we knew our subject very, very well. And what I wanted to get across there was that Reagan was up and down. His two terms were ultimately successful. He's in the top 10 best presidents. I don't rate them, Dan, but this is just from my own edification. But Reagan was almost killed, as you know. That was the subject of Killing Reagan, and certainly germane today because of what's happening with Donald Trump. He survived, miraculously rises up, and then in 1984, he's running for re-election. He gets waxed by Mondale in the first debate, and everybody goes crazy. Is Reagan losing it? Is he too old? He just looked befuddled out there, and I use a clip on the No Spin News. My TV broadcast comes out of BillO'Reilly.com about how foggy Reagan looked. But then in the second debate, again, Reagan rises up and hammers Mondale. And then a week later, because that was a late debate, Reagan wins in a landslide. So all of those narrative things are new. And we're putting all of the presidents, all 45 men, in perspective as human beings and whether they help or hurt their country.
One of the things, Bill, that I liked about the chapter on Jimmy Carter is you're honest about Jimmy Carter. You're honest about his political legacy. But then when you look at his personal post-presidential legacy, I think it paints him in a different light.
Sure. I met Jimmy Carter in 1976. I've met 7 presidents, lucky enough to be in their presence. Carter comes out of Georgia, at that time not the sophisticated state it is now, And he gets elected because Gerald Ford took over from Nixon, and Ford pardoned Nixon. He pardoned some draft dodgers in the Vietnam War, and he didn't really have a solid base, and he loses. It's close. And Carter Walsh is in there, and he just is in over his head. He just couldn't handle the national economy. He couldn't handle the villains overseas, and it was just awful. One of the weakest presidents ever. But he was well-intentioned. He wanted to do good. And then after his presidency, he did.
Okay, so I've got to ask you about this, because you were mentioning earlier Bill O'Reilly joining us on No Spin News, and you were talking about how you're taking a look at these presidents and, some of the things that folks don't know, and maybe looking at them from a more personal standpoint, among other things. How in the world did you find out that 350-pound William Howard Taft, got stuck in the bathtub?
Great story. So the way we found that out was his valet had a diary, kept a diary, because he was in the White House for about 40 years, this guy, African-American guy, and he wrote it down. And when we're investigating Taft, fascinating character, by the way, Taft gets caught in the bathtub, and he could drown. So
yeah.
They had a little bell, a little thing in the bathroom, and he pulls it, and the guy comes running in, and the guy was strong, and has to pop him out of the tub because he's 350 pounds. So what did Taft do? He ordered a bigger tub.
Oh,
he
that's
got
funny.
a tub that 3 people could take a bath in. So it's those kinds of vignettes that humanize these guys. We tell you, what they ate and how they conducted themselves. One of my favorite stories, and you'll like this because it's Tennessee-based, is that Andrew Jackson had a parrot. And he loved his parrot, and the parrot was in his office, and Jackson was swearing all over the place all day. That's what he did. Mm-hmm. And the parrot learned all the swear words. So after Jackson died, they took the parrot to the funeral, and in the middle of the service, when the minister is doing the prayers, the parrot starts swearing. And he had to move the parrot out of the funeral. It's an unbelievable story, but it's perfect for Andrew Jackson.
Oh, absolutely. And those of us in Tennessee, of course, appreciate many things that Andrew Jackson did. Let me ask you in our final moments, and I feel like I can always do an hour with you, Bill, but let me ask you the challenges of finding new things to talk about with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and some of these other folks, Abraham Lincoln. You think that everything has been written, and then you come up with new stuff.
Right, and again, that goes back to being detectives, historical detectives. When I wrote Killing Jesus, that was our toughest book to research because it was scant. There were only 2 sources of material, one in Israel, and we went there, and the other in Rome. And we had to ferret through all this stuff, and it was very, very difficult, but we pieced it together in a way that brought Jesus alive as a human being. But it was hard. After that, everything's easy. In America today, there's an enormous amount of primary source material. I know you read Killing the Witches, going all the way back to the Mayflower. And it's all stored in various museums and universities, but it's online now. And so you can get it if you know how to research, where to look for the clues. And that's how we do it.
Let me ask you, sir, was there one particular story, you just related one with Andrew Jackson, we were talking about George Washington earlier, was there one particular story that surprised you about a particular president that you were like, well, that doesn't actually check out with what I know from him from a historical perspective?
Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was one of the most corrupt presidents in our history, and he has been rehabbed by the American press, primarily because of the Great Society programs. But Johnson was really a bad hombre. And when we were uncovering all the things about how he built up his power in D.C., I mean, Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover lived across the street from one another in Georgetown. And they didn't operate but had access to a brothel run by a guy named Bobby Baker, who ultimately went to jail, one of LBJ's best friends. And they were recording and spying on all these politicians who were visiting the brothel. And Johnson was like encouraging people to go over there. And that way they got control of a lot of people, a lot of powerful people in D.C. I didn't know that.
Wow.
And
I didn't know that either.
Yeah. So when you get to the chapter of Lyndon Johnson, you see how corrupt this guy was. Awful.
All right. So your book ends with Barack Obama because, as you describe in the book, a president's true legacy isn't built until, years down the road and so forth. And so do you have sort of, though, because you're a follower of news as I am, do you have an inclination as to how history will treat Donald Trump and Joe Biden as their stories are continuing to be written?
Well, Biden's the second worst president in history because he created the problems. Most of the failed presidents, like Jimmy Carter, inherited them and couldn't deal with them. Herbert Hoover, the Great Depression. But Biden created the open border. He created the massive inflation. When he left, Trump handed him 1.4 inflation. In less than a year, it's over 9%. And that was because of things that Biden did. So he goes down, and there's no rehab in him. Awful, terrible. If Trump wins again, he has a chance to rewrite his historical legacy. If he loses, he's going to get hammered.
Let me ask you, Bill.
Not on policy, by the way, but on demeanor.
And I would agree with you on that. Let me ask you, when you look at all of these different presidents, and you've written so many books about various presidents. Now you've got this particular book, Confronting the Presidents. Do you have a favorite president? Have I asked you that before?
Lincoln, by far,
okay.
And he was my first book, Killing Lincoln. Lincoln was an extraordinary man. Oh, my God. Handed this Civil War, the worst president, James Buchanan, totally botched all control of the South. Lincoln comes in from Illinois. He can't prevent it. There's chaos everywhere. His young son dies. His wife's a nut. And the guy overcomes all of it. Really, and if you look at physically, when he walked into the White House and 4 years later when he ran for a second term, if you look at what happened to him physically, the deterioration. And the kicker is that Lincoln was a very kind man, very compassionate man. So by far and away, he is the best president, and I admire him the most.
Bill, I don't mean to throw you a curveball, but you wrote Killing Jesus. I don't know if you know the story or not. I would love to know your opinion on it. And if you're not familiar with the story, then my bad as the host. Have you seen the story about the Shroud of Turin? And now they're looking at the Shroud of Turin through new technology. And as you probably know, they said, no, this is not actually the Shroud of Turin because of the dating and the technology and all that. But now with the new technology, they're looking at this, and it's very controversial. They're saying that this actually is the Shroud of Turin now that they're looking at this through more modern technology. Do you have an opinion on that either way? I'm fascinated by this story.
No, I went to Torino, and I did a story on the Shroud years ago. People believe what they want to believe, Dan. It's certainly an eerie situation that can't be explained by any scientist. I have to say I don't know, but it's fascinating.
It is fascinating. Okay, real quick, so I've got about 2 minutes left. I want to talk about No Spin News, BillO'Reilly.com. When can folks see it? Tell me a little bit about it. We all know what you did on Fox News. Tell us about what you're doing these days.
Well, we are the most successful independent news agency in the world. We run the No Spin News out Monday through Thursday. It's our television news program, not a podcast, actual program. You can get it on BillO'Reilly.com or The First or DirecTV, you name it, we're everywhere. YouTube, we have a channel. Huge, millions, okay? YouTube.com/BillO'Reilly. That is really a game changer there. So our message is getting out. We do fair coverage, tough coverage. We call it, I'm on News Nation. I'm doing a hit with Cuomo tonight at 8 o'clock. I'm all over the place. I'm overexposed, Dan. For my age, I'm working way too hard.
Well, I can't wait for your next book. The current book, Confronting the Presidents, of course, available everywhere. And I'm assuming it's a New York Times bestseller. Your books always are. Have you decided on what your next book is going to be? And can you tell us what it might be?
We're writing it now. I can't tell you somebody will steal the idea. That's what always happens if I announce in advance. So, but we're writing. It's another confronting book, and I think you'll like it.